You're looking at the LAV-150 from a game called Armored Warfare, and this is a vehicle also known as M706 Cadillac Cage Commando. This is a vehicle that was produced by an American company called Textron back in 1963 for the Vietnam War for the American troops. And today we're going to be using this vehicle to learn a little bit more about it, but also to learn a little bit of history where this vehicle played a pivotal role and actually participated actively and ended up winning a battle. And as you can see, this is actually the Christmas or the pre-Christmas edition, because I'm recording this right before Christmas and the entire game has changed. Everything here has become more Christmassy and there's even a Christmas tree in the background. And welcome to What the Math. Today we're going to be learning a little bit about history using LAV-150 from Armored Warfare. Now, you'll notice there's a big door right here and there's also a somewhat big door right here as well. This is because it is actually an APC. This is a vehicle that's meant to deliver armored personnel to their location by using sort of an armored transporter that is very similar to a Humvee vehicle that's quite famous in the United States. But except for being an APC, this is also a multi-purpose vehicle. It actually has a lot of various attachments that you can check out by going to upgrades, but this is not even close to having all of the attachments. It has a mortar attachment that you can replace this part right here. It has an anti-tank attachment that you can actually purchase by going into this right here. So this is actually the anti-tank version of the vehicle that has a 90mm turret. And the biggest turret that it had was a 105mm turret that was meant for specifically for the anti-tank role. And because this vehicle is so multi-purpose, it was purchased by many countries, including countries like Saudi Arabia, Philippines, Lebanon, Thailand, Vietnam, and even the Republic of China. Many countries use this vehicle for many different purposes because it is literally multi-purpose. It's sort of like a Swiss knife. It can do many different things and do it relatively well. And let's take this tank for a ride. So we're actually fighting quite a lot of Chinese tanks on the other side. There's a lot of Type 59 tanks which have been recently added to the game, and which means that we're probably going to be at disadvantage, but we do have the maneuverability and the speed. Now, the way this vehicle works in real life is during the war, it's usually supported by the Air Force, and it's used as a scout slash support force for the troops that are inside this tank. Oh, okay. Almost smacked into this Dragon 90. And here we go. Here's our first target. Let's try to do some damage to him. And look at that. We did a little bit of damage, scared him, and he's now running away. Now, because of the speed of this vehicle and because it's essentially a support vehicle, it's meant for combined force attacks. It's never really used by itself. And as you can see, it's really more of a skirmish tank than anything else. In this game, however, it can be used for many different purposes. If you're using the premium tank with a 90mm cannon, you can obviously use it as a tank destroyer, and it's very effective at that. Of course, it has a very low armor, and it's not really powerful against some of the more difficult to penetrate targets, but it nevertheless, because of its speed and because it moves really, really fast, you can usually cause a lot of damage, run away, and come back and do some more damage. Now, the way I often play with this tank is essentially skirmish. I usually just do attack, run away, and I use a lot of the okay, here comes the... Okay, that almost killed me. Here, basically, I use a lot of heavy explosive rounds because they're... Even though they don't penetrate, they usually do a lot of damage. You can also obviously play a role of scout, which I'm doing right now. I'm trying to just scout these positions and discover these guys so that the other people can hit them, but I can also obviously destroy people. So this is a pretty cool tank. It's very, very fast. It's a little bit difficult to control because it's a little bit too fast, but overall, it's actually kind of fun to play. Now, this tank was originally used during the Vietnam War by the American forces, but it was, even though it was actually quite successful, it was overshadowed by the success of M113, which I talked about in one of the previous videos. And this tank was actually so successful that many countries decided to purchase it for their own ranks and decided to actually modify it to their own needs. For example, Singapore purchased this tank and made it even more powerful. Oh boy, someone's right here. And actually made it a much more effective vehicle than it is right now. And just like that, killed by yet another LAV-150. That's kind of ironic and actually shows you how effective this tank is because it's mobile and can sneak up on different enemies from direction they don't expect them to come from. So anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a mission where this tank actually played a really important role and where it actually was the first tank to engage in battle, and that's of course the Gulf War. This was actually the first tank to be used in the Gulf War by the American and the Saudi forces. And we're going to be talking about so-called Battle of Khafji, where quite a lot of these tanks were used to defeat quite a lot of T-55s, which were kind of similar to T-59 tanks that I was facing in this particular battle. And now let's switch to Wargame Red Dragon and try to simulate one of the battles where this tank played a very important role. Now actually this tank has been used in many smaller engagements, and it's even used in Los Angeles by LAPD to basically try to arrest some of the more dangerous criminals, because it's technically also a police tank. But we're going to take a look at a battle where this tank played its main role, specifically support tank for the main invasion force, and also was basically used by the Saudi Arabian forces to try to reclaim some of the territory. So what we're talking about, of course, is the Gulf War. Now this war is known by many other names. It's also known as Persian Gulf War, First Gulf War, Kuwait War, or First Iraq War. And basically this lasted from about August of 1990 to February of 1991, and started when Saddam Hussein, then the leader of the Iraqi forces, invaded Kuwait with the main idea of then invading Saudi Arabia and trying to take over the oil fields in that region. Now, in one of the previous videos, I talked about the Iraqi-Iranian war, and this was actually about 10 years before this. And during this war, US actually supported Iraq. It even provided some of the weaponry to kind of try to overthrow the Iranian regime, because it was actually the regime that US really didn't support. And unfortunately, during that war, Iraq spent quite a lot of funds, a lot of money. And by August 1988, Iraq was in heavy debt from the US, but also from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. So it actually owed them quite a lot of money. And it tried to intimidate them by using their force to try to forgive that debt so that they wouldn't have to repay it. But at the same time, Iraq also claimed that Kuwait was part of its territory back from the days of the Ottoman Empire. So they actually wanted to annex Kuwait. One of the reasons, of course, was because they had oil, but also because they actually claimed the territory. But then there was also the fact that Kuwait was overproducing oil and selling oil at a slightly cheaper price. So because of that, Iraq, that was also producing some oil, was actually not making as much money, and they actually were getting really upset with Kuwait and decided to actually take military action. And so in early August of 1990, Iraq decided to invade Kuwait because the negotiations were just not going anywhere. They actually at this point had fourth largest army in the world, with close to 1 million standing soldiers, a lot of paramilitary forces, and something like 4,500 tanks as well. And so invading such a tiny nation as Kuwait with barely 20,000 forces was not a big deal for them, and they succeeded almost overnight. And because Kuwait region was now occupied and Iraq had access to both their oil fields and also their air force bases as well, this also meant that Iraq had now means to basically attacking Saudi Arabia and controlling their oil fields as well. And this essentially put Iraq in something like 90% of the entire world's oil reserves, and they could basically control the prices of oil just by striking at Saudi Arabian oil fields. And unfortunately for Saddam Hussein, he also started to verbally attack the Saudi forces or Saudi government, and he started making a lot of threats and a lot of claims, and basically provoked the coalition forces to try to protect them. Now, this was actually a UN proposition, and in November of 1990, they passed a resolution where the coalition forces were created, and these were forces that combined 34 countries, including countries like Canada, USA, Denmark, France, and even some Arab countries like Oman, Qatar, and obviously Saudi Arabia. And unfortunately for Iraq, its biggest ally, Soviet Union, also supported the resolution. Actually, this was one of the first times where Soviets didn't actually veto the vote, and they stopped supporting Iraq that they supported previously. And this, of course, was because they were also producing their own oil, and they didn't want Iraq to control or to have so much control over the oil production. And so in January of 1991, specifically on January 17th of 1991, the coalition forces began their airstrikes, leading to the Operation Desert Storm. And these airstrikes were really successful. Essentially, most of the Iraqi forces was destroyed by the airplanes, not by anyone else, not by the tanks, not by the forces, but by the Air Force. And surprisingly, the Iraqi anti-aircraft defenses were actually quite ineffective against the coalition aircraft. And with something like 100,000 sorties by different airplanes, only 75 aircraft were actually lost. But in retaliation to all of these attacks, the Iraqi decided to launch their Scud missiles, and they aimed them at the Saudi Arabian oil fields, at Saudi Arabian cities, and also at Israel, which of course Iraqi was against as well. And the reason why they actually attacked Israel, which is actually quite interesting, is because they wanted to provoke Israeli to attack Iraq. And of course, provoking Israel into attacking Iraq would also mean that a lot of the Arab states, including Saudi Arabia and Oman, would obviously leave the alliance or the coalition forces and would possibly be forced to join Iraq as well. And even though Israeli were going to attack Iraq, and they actually even had their air force already on the way to attack Iraq, President Bush convinced the then Prime Minister Shamir to not attack and to actually back off and to just wait, because this would obviously cause Syrians, Jordanians, and Egyptians to join the war and possibly even cause a third world war. And even though 74 Israelis actually died from these attacks, Israel decided to just wait it out and let the Americans handle the war. And a few weeks after this, Iraqi forces attacked and occupied a small town in Saudi Arabia called Khafji. Now, they actually used tanks, T-55 tanks specifically, and a lot of infantry to try to occupy this little town, and they were quite successful at doing so. But as they were attacking them and as they actually tried to battle their way into the town, the Americans launched quite a lot of airstrikes and also used their ships to try to decimate the Saudi tanks. And they were able to destroy most of the tanks, but for some reason a lot of the T-55 tanks survived the attacks and were able to stay in the town. Now, this was actually the example, or one of the first examples in modern war history, where the Air Force was essentially responsible for defeating most of the hard and heavy armor. And interestingly, one of the Iraqi soldiers who survived this particular battle even stated that he had sustained more punishment from the Allied air power in 30 minutes of this battle than in 8 years of fighting against Iran. That's how powerful the coalition airplane strikes were. But having taken the town of Khafji, the coalition forces had to strike back and try to take it back. And so this was actually the first engagement of the coalition forces against the Iraqi forces. And interestingly, they didn't really use any of the heavier tanks like M1 Abrams tanks or Challenger tanks that they did have. They actually used several dozens of the LAV-150 tanks that were essentially meant for transporting troops, but also for destroying the tanks. So these were the anti-tank versions of these light vehicles, and they were facing much heavier, much more well-armored and well-armed T-55s, but also the Chinese Type 59 and Type 69 tanks that were sold to Iraq by China that were quite similar to T-55s as well. And so here we're basically recreating this battle where we're essentially facing these heavy forces, but on our side we have the advantage of having better reconnaissance. We also have a few airplanes that support us with airstrikes. And of course, one main thing that US had that Iraqi didn't was the GPS, or also known as Global Positioning System, that back then was a new thing. So because of the GPS, the Americans were able to position themselves precisely where they needed to be. And it also allowed them to create new strategies and also new precise tactics where they could basically go around the map without getting lost and attack enemy from the flank or from the back without them knowing that they're coming. But in this specific battle, there were only 4 countries participating against Iraq. So here we had the United Kingdom forces, we had forces from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, and they only used 2 types of heavy vehicles. They've used AMX-30 tanks and also LAV-150S tanks that were used to destroy T-55s. And this mission was so successful, as a matter of fact, that only 7 vehicles were lost. But even though the bulk of Iraqi forces in this town consisted of T-55s, they even had a few T-62s and a few BMP-1 APC vehicles. and even T-72s, which were actually the most advanced versions of the T-tanks from the Soviet Union at that time, and would obviously cause a lot of trouble to the coalition forces had they not been destroyed by their air attacks. And while the majority of tanks were actually destroyed by the strikes from F-16s, A-10 airplanes, and also AC-130 airplanes, when the coalition forces started to try to recapture the city of Kavji, their lightly armored LAV-150 vehicles along with AMX-30 tanks were actually able to destroy quite a lot of T-55s without suffering any of their own casualties. And actually the only casualties that they did receive were from artillery fire or from friendly fire. So most of the T-55s were not very effective at destroying any of the lightly armored LAV-150 tanks, or if they did destroy one, it was not from a tank fire. And interestingly, this was actually the first battle the Qatari forces have ever seen, and this was actually their first fight, and they were doing surprisingly good. So along with the Saudi forces, they were able to recapture the city within a few days. And with only about 20 armored vehicles left in the city, all they had to do was find and destroy them. And because the Iraqi morale was actually falling at this point and they realized there was no hope for them, a lot of them surrendered and essentially abandoned their tanks. But those tanks that kept fighting ended up being destroyed by the LAV-150 vehicles, and it was most likely due to the fact that they were so good at using combined force tactics and were quite mobile, a lot more mobile and a lot faster than T-55 tanks. And essentially they could easily approach a tank from behind, fire in its weak point and destroy it before the T-55 tank could even try to turn around or try to fire back. And the success during this battle, specifically the Battle of Kavji, served as a modern example of how powerful the Air Force can be when serving as a support to ground forces, and essentially really changed the way wars and battles would progress from then on. So most countries realized that it was really all about the Air Force, not so much about the tanks anymore. And this gave the idea to the coalition forces that in order for them to win the Operation Desert Storm, they actually had to rely on their aircraft. But ironically, most of the casualties from this war on the coalition side were from friendly fire and once again from the airplanes. So it was really due to misidentification of the friendly forces as the enemy, where the aircraft would accidentally destroy their own forces and would essentially cause friendly casualties. And as a result of this very successful air strike campaign, the actual land battle, or basically battle using tanks and forces, only lasted for about 100 hours in total. And at the end of the battle, Iraqi withdrew from Kuwait. They agreed to a ceasefire, and a lot of the casualties and destruction to Iraq was essentially caused by the airplanes. These airstrikes also destroyed something like 80% of the entire tank force of Iraq, and obviously what used to be the fourth most powerful army in the world was now the shadow of its former self and had barely any tanks or any other military equipment left. They also lost a lot of helicopters, a lot of aircraft, and a lot of naval vessels to the airstrikes. And on top of that, now also had a lot of economic sanctions against their own country. So Iraq was actually in a lot more trouble now than it was before the start of the war. And even though by itself LAV-150 would not win this war, it was a good representation of what did win this war, and this was of course combined arms. So here the combination of the fact that this was a troop transporter that was able to also destroy both tanks and infantry, and was also able to be very mobile, discover enemy positions, and also was used as a scout or as a reconnaissance vehicle, and of course had amphibious capabilities as well, meaning that it could actually move across water and be used as a kind of a multi-purpose transportation vehicle, was really the reason why this war was won so quickly, because the combination of reconnaissance and combined arms was the reason why the coalition forces were so successful against the somewhat rigid and somewhat defensive Iraqi forces. And one more interesting fact about this conflict is that this was actually the last time in World War history where a battleship was actually used for any kind of operation. This was the last time battleships were actively used, but because of the dangers of various missiles hitting them, they only were used as the missile launching platforms, launching various Tomahawk missiles at various targets in both Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And these two battleships that were actually used during the Operation Desert Storm were Missouri and Wisconsin. And even though they did get to use their 16-inch or 406mm guns to fire at land targets, they mostly launched missiles, and they mostly were used in a support role, unlike in previous wars where they were actually the main battle strike force, specifically in World War II. And of course, this conflict also serves as a reminder of how much power the oil actually has in the world today. So the only reason Soviets didn't support the Iraqi was of course because of oil, or because the oil prices would actually be controlled by the Iraq. And the only reason this conflict even started was of course because Iraqi forces were threatening to control the entire oil production in the region. And even though technically the coalition forces didn't really much care about Saudi Arabia by itself, and actually would support Israel over the Arabic states, because most of their oil came from that region, it was really important for them to actually have some sort of control and some sort of friendly force that would actually produce and sell them oil at a reasonable price. And even though most wars before that were ideological or religious in nature, this was one of the first times where a war was fought entirely due to economic reasons. And of course, many other wars that the United States and the coalition forces fought afterwards were quite the same. Anyway, so hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you learned a little bit more about LAV-150, Operation Desert Storm, and the first Gulf War against Iraq, and of course Battle of Khafji in Saudi Arabia. That was the first battle fought during the Gulf War, and essentially showed the world that now the wars were going to be fought with the Air Force and not with tanks. And if you've enjoyed this video, check out some of the other videos I've posted on this channel, and subscribe and like this video as well. Also, don't forget to share it with your friends and show it to people that you think will like military videos and do enjoy watching them. And anyway guys, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and Happy Holidays, and in the next video we're going to explore another tank, another battle, and another historical account. Thank you for watching, and game you later. Bye bye.